episode of the Paleoconnection. I'm Brandon, and I'm joined again by Verv. We also have a special guest today, Jonathan. He is from the Antinatalism community, and the reason why we have him on the show today is because we will be talking about antinatalism. Now, perhaps you haven't heard of what it is, and that's okay. I myself first learned about antinatalism about 6 months ago. So let me give you a definition first, and then I'll give a brief history. And after that, we'll start with our guest, Jonathan. This show will take on more of an interview format than our past shows. So first, what is antinatalism? Well, antinatalism is a philosophical position and social movement that assigns a negative value to birth. In other words, antinatalists argue that people should abstain from procreation because it is morally bad. Okay, now with that, let me give a brief history. So finding a history on antinatalism online is somewhat difficult because the term itself is actually somewhat new. However, there have been people in the past that have had ideas that kind of map on to what we consider modern antinatalism. We know that some of the earliest surviving formulations of the idea that it would be better not to have been born come from ancient Greece, and some even consider philosophers like Aristotle to be sympathetic to the notion. We also know that certain philosophers of ancient India from around 700 BC believed in reincarnation and sought a way to not be reborn so that they could avoid all the unnecessary suffering this world has to offer. There was likely also Indian philosophers who did not believe in reincarnation, but who did believe that life was mostly suffering, and those individuals would abstain from procreation and they would have a spiritual life practicing meditation. Some people trace more modern thoughts of antinatalism to a man named Arthur Schopenhauer. I might be messing up that name, as he is a 19th century German philosopher. Perhaps Jonathan can help us out with that name. But he argued, among many other things, that life is ultimately negative because any positive experiences will always be outweighed by suffering, which is a more powerful feeling. You'll notice that suffering is going to play a major role in the discussion today. The term antinatalism itself, though, was probably used for the first time in a 2006 book by, I might be messing this name up, Théophile de Girard, who is French, and the book was named The Art of Guillotining the Procreators, Antinatalist Manifesto. Pretty dark title. That is the English translation of the French. Also, there was a 2006 book which is rather famous in the antinatalist community that is called Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence. This is by David Benatar, who's one of the he wrote one of the more popular books dealing with the idea of antinatalism, and Benatar himself has been one of the more outspoken supporters of the philosophy, both online and in print media. Even some mainstream media sources have covered his beliefs. Some other well-known antinatalists include Julio Cabrera and Karim Akerma. All right, with that being said, I'd like to bring in our guest, Jonathan, now. And Jonathan, if you could just briefly introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, sure. So, hi everyone, my name is Jonathan. I'm from Germany and I'm 29 years old. And I've been an antinatalist, or I've adopted the term, I guess, I believe roughly 4 years ago, when I first got interested in the topic after watching a popular HBO show called True Detective, the first season. Maybe some of you have seen that already. And I read an interview with the creator of the show, Nick Pizzolatto, I think is his name. And in the interview, he went a little bit into what kind of literary influences he had in creating one of the main characters in the show, played by Matthew McConaughey. And he mentioned David Benatar's book, Better Never to Have Been, as well as a book by Thomas Ligotti, who's a fiction author, actually. He's not a philosopher. He writes mostly horror fiction, weird fiction, I guess. and he wrote a nonfiction book in 2010, I think, 2009, 2010, called The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. It's also a quite dark title, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, that got me interested because I enjoyed the show a lot, and I ordered those two books, Benatar's and Lingotti's, and yeah, that's how I originally got into it.
Is it correct that that antinatalism was used for the first time in Girard's book? Is that correct? You know?
Usually people attribute the term to him, but I'm not really sure if he really was the first one. Sometimes people attribute it to Benatar, actually.
Did Benatar does he use the term antinatalism in Better Never to Have Been? Or does he not use the term? He does use the term in the book.
Yeah, he does use the term, but I think his book came out after
Girard's. In the same year? Yeah, okay.
A little bit later in the same year. So it's a bit contentious who coined the term, but typically people attribute it to Girard.
Okay.
It was interesting that you mentioned True Detective. Season 1 was really a phenomenal show, and you can really see the antinatalist influence there with McConaughey's character. But at the end, he kind of does do a little bit of a U-turn on that.
True.
Did that disgust you a little bit? Did you think that was pulling the punch too much?
No. I'm actually one of the guys who actually liked the ending of the show, but a lot of people in the community thought the ending was a bit tacked on and they didn't like it very much. Right. But my interpretation of it is pretty positive. I enjoyed the ending.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, excellent.
Okay.
So about the antinatalist community, I'm kind of curious. Who are the people generally in the antinatalist community? How would you describe, to break down the demographics a little bit, what kind of cultures of people do you see in it?
Yeah, so as Brandon already discussed, the idea is a pretty old one, but the community aspect of it is pretty new, actually. It has to do with new technologies, people connecting via the internet and whatnot. And you really find a lot of people from different backgrounds in the community. Like you have people with different social backgrounds, different political opinions, sometimes different justifications for why they are antinatalists, actually. So there's a lot of contention there as well. It's not a really homogeneous community. It's very, very heterogeneous. Yeah.
Would you say it skews a bit young? Would that be something that, for me, I just kind of envision it being younger? Are there many older people in it?
I mean, we had a little bit of a spike in the community in terms of traffic of Facebook groups, Discord servers, and such. When Benatar kind of blew up a little bit when he went on to, I believe it was Sam Harris's podcast. That was the first time we really noticed, okay, there's a big influx of new people being interested in this idea. And yeah, a lot of them are pretty young, probably in their teens or early adulthood. But you really find people of all kinds of demographics in the community. Yeah.
Okay. So one of my first experiences with antinatalism would actually come through extreme metal music. I'm a big fan of black metal, and I listen to some DSBM, depressive suicidal black metal. Yeah, and it was interesting reading some interviews. I don't remember the band off the top of my head, but there was even one band saying that they had heard about two different people that actually were helped push towards their own suicide by listening to this music. And they talked about how they felt like, wow, it was great to be able to help somebody make this important decision in their life. Very politically incorrect stuff. But, I wonder, do you see some amount of the community coming from this, kind of dark black metal background, or is that just something that's really a minority of cases?
Well, we do have a lot of people who are into metal music and just they enjoy the dark aesthetics of it, I guess. But something I think is really important to put an emphasis on here is that antinatalism is not about suicide necessarily.
Sure.
Right? It's not about the value of continuing a life. It's more about the value of starting a life, or this value, I guess. But yeah, there's a lot of people in the community who enjoy, heavy music, dark and depressing movies, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Let me jump in here for a second. So, Jonathan, would you say that originally you said True Detective was kind of like the impetus that brought you into, like, I guess you could say, discovering what antinatalist thought was? Or like, what about like before that? Was there any kind of time in your life where you kind of felt like, well, there's overpopulation in society, and I think I'd rather not contribute to that? Wasn't there any other kind of like thoughts in your childhood, that may have contributed to kind of latching onto this philosophy?
Well, me personally, I never really planned on having kids, but I didn't really thought of this as an ethical obligation not to have kids. I just thought, okay, it's probably not for me, right?
Okay.
And really, the first time I got exposed to this idea that you could make this universal claim that nobody should have kids, that really happened after I got into those two books I mentioned, Benatar's book and Ligotti's book, because I found the arguments were pretty convincing, right?
Okay, so you kind of saw it like you never really wanted to have kids in the first place, and then you kind of picked up on this philosophy that kind of, would you say, in a sense, validated that choice and made it like very logical to you?
It validated it to some extent, I guess, but I wouldn't say that I've always been an antinatalist or something like that, because I think there's a difference between having a personal stance on procreation, that maybe having kids for me is not the right thing, and making a universalist claim of I believe it's ethically incorrect to have children as a universal position, that nobody should do that.
Right.
Okay.
So I draw a distinction there, and that's why I usually say I've been an antinatalist for 4 years, even before that I didn't plan on having any. Yeah.
Okay. Also, a few more questions. So do you consider yourself an atheist then, or agnostic, or do you believe in any god?
I'd say I'm an atheist, pretty hardcore atheist. Yeah.
Okay. So
curious, on that same vein, would you say that the overwhelming majority of the antinatalist movement is atheist, or do you find that you have a surprising amount of Buddhist or Christian members as well?
Well, I'd say the overwhelming majority is probably atheist, but there are quite a few religious people in it as well. It's not just Christians; it's also Muslims or ex-Muslims sometimes.
Oh wow.
Buddhists, Hindus, yeah, it's pretty diverse in that regard, yeah. But the overwhelming majority is probably atheists. Yeah.
Wow, very interesting. I would have thought that there would be almost no Muslims because, as I understand it, there really isn't an ascetic tradition or ascetic tradition of rejecting childbirth and taking on these vows of celibacy. You could argue that that some amount of the whirling dervishes, the Sufis, kind of do that, but comparatively, it really seems like Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity are much more exclusively into viewing life as suffering and not necessarily worth procreation. So
Yeah,
I'm quite surprised to hear that.
Yeah, the Muslim community within the antinatalist community is very small, and most of them, they identify as ex-Muslim. So
oh wow.
They are atheists, but they have a Muslim background. So
okay.
That's what I mean. But as far as Muslim or Islamic tradition goes, I think I agree that it probably doesn't lend itself well to antinatalist thought. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Jonathan, would you like to perhaps kind of go through a little bit of rundown of like what you believe antinatalism to be and like some of the core tenets of it, and how it has to do with suffering and
Sure.
Go ahead.
So starting with Benatar, who is probably the most popular antinatalist philosopher who's still alive. He puts a very strong emphasis on this balance or symmetry between pleasure and pain, or pain as suffering. It's not just physical pain, but pain in general, emotional pain, physical pain, psychological pain. And his argument is basically that there is an axiological asymmetry, that's the technical term he uses, between the amount and the intensity of pain versus the amount and intensity of pleasure in life. And he makes the argument that on the basis of this asymmetry, it is wrong to create another sentient being. So he does not talk exclusively about humans. Most of the examples in his book are about humans, but he extends this to all sentient beings, basically. And not all antinatalists have this position. Some of them really only talk about humans. Others extend it to most other sentient animals as well.
Okay.
And I don't know if you have any specific questions about his asymmetry, because it's probably one of the most contentious arguments even within antinatalism. Not all antinatalists agree with it 100%. And yeah.
Yeah, so you would say that you definitely buy into the belief that bringing somebody into the world, bringing a new life into the world, there is sort of I guess you could say, a utilitarian type balance of suffering and pleasure, and it's always more towards the suffering. Like it's never, except perhaps in the most extreme circumstances, would somebody experience more pleasure than suffering in life.
I wouldn't say I'm a utilitarian actually. And I don't think Benatar makes this claim as well. I think the term he uses for his proposal is that it's theory neutral, that it works with all kinds of meta-ethical frameworks such as utilitarianism, negative utilitarianism, deontology, whatever. And while I value Benatar because I believe his argument is very concise and I agree with a lot of things, it's ultimately not my most favorite argument in favor of antinatalism. I do believe that suffering is extremely important, and that ethics usually should be concerned with a minimization or prevention of suffering as opposed to a maximization or increase of pleasure. But
okay.
I don't think, I believe it's a little bit difficult to put these very abstract concepts like pleasure and suffering into, absolute or numeric terms. Yeah.
Do you believe Benatar's sort of idea or claim that pretty much every human has more suffering than pleasure, and it's almost impossible to find, humans that, if you were to weigh the pleasure and suffering amount, to have more pleasure than suffering? Like, do you agree with how he claims that?
I'm actually a bit skeptical about that claim, because I think it's really hard to actually prove that, right?
Yeah,
because in order to do that, you'd have to quantify suffering and pleasure somehow, right? You'd have to slap numbers on it and then compare.
Right.
Okay, what has the bigger value? Is there more of one thing or more of the other thing? And I think that's a bit difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I know he talks a lot about what he calls an optimism bias that people have.
Yeah.
He has a lot of scientific research that shows it. So he claims that even if an individual person believes, my life is good, my life has more pleasure than suffering, that is not true, and we should not actually believe what that person says. Do you also agree with that kind of claim that he has, that we shouldn't trust people's own judgments because it's clouded by biological factors and an optimism bias, that we can't actually see how bad life really is?
I think optimism bias is a pretty well recognized concept in psychology, but so is pessimism bias, actually.
So is
pessimism bias is
okay.
Pessimism bias is probably not as common, and I don't think there's as much research done in that area, but optimism bias is definitely a thing, yeah. And there's this thing called depressive realism, which sometimes gets brought up in the context of antinatalism, which kind of goes into that issue of having cognitive biases, right? That people tend to think of themselves as exceptional, and even though statistics may indicate that you have a decent chance of dying from cancer or getting into a car accident and whatnot, that people intuitively will think, well, that might be statistically likely, but not me, right?
Right.
So I think it's true in that sense that people tend to underestimate how much harm or suffering there is in the average life, but I think it's difficult to make an absolute claim about that the average life absolutely does contain more suffering than harm, because I personally think it's really hard to quantify that and put that in absolute terms.
Sure. So would you say that then maybe one of the important aspects of this is for you is more of the asymmetry of pleasure and pain?
Well, what I like about Benatar's asymmetry is that it's a comparison between two very different states of affairs, basically. Two different states of being or non-being, I guess. And the argument he makes, I think, works even if you assume that the total amount and the total intensity of suffering is not necessarily does not necessarily outweigh the pleasure, because part of his asymmetry is, of course, that how shall I put it? That on the absence side of being, so in the case of not being born, the absence of the suffering would still be considered to be a good thing. And he uses this example about Mars, I believe, that usually people would say there's no life on Mars, and the absence of life on Mars means there's no suffering, and that is a good thing, right?
Yeah, he uses that as well to talk about like the argument that, well, if there's no people on Earth, there will be no art or music or anything. And but on Mars, we never think like, oh, there's no art or music. There's no Martian art or music. So thus we're losing something from that. He claims that, we don't think that way. So we shouldn't think that way if humans went extinct and we had no culture or art. We wouldn't, nobody would be there to appreciate it or not appreciate it. So it doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. That's how he introduces this asymmetry argument. Basically, he says that the absence of pain is usually good, whereas the absence of pleasure is not necessarily bad, because it's only bad if there is someone who's deprived of that pleasure. And if there's no one around, there's nobody to be deprived. So it's more of a neutral state of affairs instead of a negative or good one.
Yeah. Jacob, would you like to continue, or would you like to throw it back to me?
Oh, I think I had initially had misunderstood the asymmetry here. I was not familiar with Benatar. I'm very glad that you clarified that for me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a little bit unintuitive, I think, because usually when people first hear this argument, they think, oh, he's saying there's just so much more suffering in the world that it outweighs all the pleasure that is also there, right? But that's not really what he is saying. I mean, he makes an argument to that extent also in the book, where he goes through, empirical data suggesting that suffering in the average life is usually a little bit higher in terms of intensity or duration as well. There's, chronic illness, disabilities, mental health issues, all that stuff that lasts very long, but which he would call chronic suffering. But there's no such thing as chronic pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I had thought of it from a bit of a Buddhist perspective, where one of the common examples that we get with arguments against lust and why celibacy is a good thing is because you have this period in your life where you're young and you're virile and you can enjoy, you enjoy sex and you enjoy the pleasures of the body. But as soon as you hit 30, 35, your market value begins to go down. And then you become someone who's in their older age, is used to a lot of pleasure, and now can never attain it again. And you spend the rest of your life still burning with lust, but not being able to ever fulfill it. And that so much of the pleasures that we have, whether it is, lust or gluttony, they're actually very hard to get rid of once you have become, used to them and conditioned to them. And so in the end, enjoying a lot of soft pleasure means that you will enjoy a lot of moral difficulties for the rest of your life.
Yeah, right. I mean, sometimes people call that the hedonic treadmill. The fact that once you've experienced pleasure, and that's really an amazing experience, I don't think anybody is really disputing that you kind of get addicted to it, right?
Right.
You want more of it, you want it again and again and again, and eventually, just due to old age and decay, your body isn't doing it anymore, right? You're not capable anymore of enjoying the same things that you used to enjoy. Maybe because you're just so old that you can't indulge in the same activities you used to indulge when you were younger.
Right.
And
that is
the
diminishing
inherent
high.
Yeah. But,
right.
I mean, that's
the high of everything.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah. The high of everything, begins to diminish, and you require a bigger dose, and it's still never quite the same. It kind of reminds me of there was an Ingmar Bergman film I watched in which an old woman was describing the process of how colors were no longer so sharp and tastes were now more dull, and that eventually, all experience heads into a more unfulfilling state, right?
Yeah, I think it might also have something to do with the novelty of it getting lost, right? You kind of get used to the stimuli, and it's not as pleasurable the second time as it used to be the first time. And that kind of goes on and on and on until your brain totally dulls to the stimuli. Yeah. So that's definitely also an issue. But I guess we could move a little bit more into a different argument than Benatar's, because Benatar really doesn't put the emphasis on this. His argument is very technical, and it's really mostly about this asymmetry he outlines, right?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you another question.
Sure.
So, what do you feel about the idea that if all humans went extinct, and let's say animals too, that had sentience, if they all went extinct, we would lose all consciousness in the universe, assuming there's no aliens or whatnot. And that loss of consciousness itself is some kind of loss to the universe. Consciousness itself is valuable. Therefore, if we allow all humans to go extinct and all animals that are semi-conscious or conscious, then there's a loss there that can't be quantified. What do you think about that argument against antinatalism?
Well, I'd say it would be a loss to those conscious entities, which would presumably go extinct. But in the absence of consciousness, you can't really speak about loss, in my opinion, because once it's done, there are no experiences anymore who could experience the loss. So, I mean, after all the consciousness is gone, it's just gone, and you can't really speak about loss anymore. Right?
Okay. So you don't believe there would be any sort of, I know what you're saying, that nobody conscious is there to experience it, so there can't be a feeling of loss. But I guess this is sort of more of a metaphysical. Do you consider yourself just a purely materialist then?
I'm leaning pretty far in the materialist side of things. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so
but I'm not sure my metaphysics are necessarily that important about my ethical beliefs. I think what makes what makes life valuable in a positive or a negative sense is just the fact that we have this first person experience of the world, that we are experiences. And I think if you take that away, or if it just fizzles out at some point, then the question of whether or not something is good or bad or ethically wrong or right, and those questions, they simply don't apply anymore, right? Because when there's no experience, or nobody that has experiences, these categories, right, wrong, good, bad, they simply don't apply anymore.
Okay. Jacob, would you like to jump in, or I got some more questions here.
Oh, I was actually more curious to hear, Jonathan, if you're not such a, if the Benatar arguments here are more technical and you'd like to move beyond them, what would be the arguments that you would like to perhaps present and focus on as far as what you think is important to antinatalism?
Yeah, since Brandon in the introduction already brought up Julio Cabrera, I hope I pronounced that right. He's an Argentinian philosopher, I think, but he's been living and teaching in Brazil for a pretty long time now, I think. His writings are mostly in Portuguese, but a little bit of it has been translated into English, so that's how I got exposed to it. And I personally like his argument in favor of antinatalism a little bit more than Benatar's, because it doesn't rely on this very technical asymmetry. It's more of a metaphysical argument, I guess. Something that is about the structure of being itself.
Wow.
Can you describe it? Can you describe it a bit for the audience? Like what is the exact argument?
So his ethical theory is called the negative ethics, and it's not just about antinatalism, it's about a lot of things, but antinatalism is a part of it. And he makes the argument that the structure of being itself is basically a terminal structure, right? That from the get-go, when you give somebody life, they're already caught up in this process of termination, right? We know that if you create a new person, that person will eventually die, right? And this process from birth to death is also characterized by a lot of friction, I believe he calls it, and conflict. It's a constant conflict, basically. We are biological organisms that require sustenance. We require shelter. We are also social animals that require socialization and so forth. And that is a source of a lot of friction, as he calls it, and manipulation. And his argument is basically that because the structure of being is in itself terminal and characterized by this aspect of manipulation, that nobody is being brought into existence for their own sake, but usually for the sake of the interests of their progenitors or other people, that it's a moral wrong to do that. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. So you definitely buy into that kind of argument more than Benatar's.
Well, yeah, I think there are some things about Benatar that are valuable and that I really enjoy, but the thing that turns me off about it is just this calculus thing of pain and pleasure. Yeah, that's really what in my opinion is a little bit unconvincing, because I think it's so hard to put that actually into to quantify that up against each other and make this determination that, okay, there's more suffering than pleasure. And that's not what Cabrera is concerned with. His argument works basically independently of the contents of any given life. It's about the structure of being itself.
I'm a bit confused, though, as far as Cabrera's argument. If he doesn't say that life is more, let's say, bad than good, more suffering than pleasure, even though that it's, as you said, terminus, it eventually will come to an end. How does he validate that even though it will come to an end, it's still not worth living? Like if you live your life and it's a fantastic life, and I don't know if he believes that's even possible, isn't it still worth living even though it will end?
Well, part of his negative ethics is this idea that living the good life, quote unquote, or living a moral life is essentially impossible. That's one of the basic assumptions he makes. And going from this, very negative or pessimistic ontology, he develops this argument that because the conditions of life are so inherently impoverished and negative, that you shouldn't impose that on other people. So the suffering definitely plays a role. So he talks about sufferings and such, but he's not really concerned with measuring those up against pleasures or whatever.
Right. So it's more about. So it's more about the metaphysical structure of being means that we are in usually exploitive relationships, in that suffering is just kind of inherent aspect, and that life is so much focused on what you said is friction and manipulation, right?
Yeah. So his argument is basically that the characteristics of life are basically a struggle against those sufferings and against injustices, failures, and against manipulation. And a procreative act, in his opinion, is structurally more similar to an act of killing than it is to anything else.
So what would his argument be then for against just killing yourself to make the world and your situation better? I know Benatar always makes sure that he states that, I believe we should not procreate, but, people who are already alive, we should try to provide them with the longest life possible. How does Cabrera make that point, or does he not believe that?
Cabrera is a little bit different than Benatar in that regard, I think. He makes an argument in favor of what he calls a rational suicide. But he's very specific about the circumstances in which such a rational suicide should be considered an option. He's not just saying, okay, everybody just kill yourself right now. That's not what he's saying. His idea of the rational suicide is that if you come up against a situation in which you weigh your options, you say, okay, I'm in this position right now, and I have ABC options available to me, and one of those options would be suicide. And if you determine that that option will result in the least amount of harm, then you should do that.
Wouldn't you say, though, that that's a bit of a kind of a cop-out with him, like a rational suicide? Like, I'm sure he doesn't want to seem so extreme to just say, like you said, everybody kill yourself. But he kind of tones it down by saying, well, you should only kill yourself if rationally you believe that, your life will end up better by killing yourself than letting it go on. But if life is just full of suffering and manipulation, and the whole character of our being from the beginning is like corrupted, wouldn't it just make more sense for everybody to just kill themselves immediately? I mean, we're fighting a losing battle. It's not like by lasting another year, you are somehow going to improve your lot, your existence, because from the start, it's, as you said, it's just, corrupted.
Yeah, sure. You have to be careful, though, not to conflate those two things. So on the one hand, he has this antinatalist position that people should abstain from creating people in the first place. But he also tries to make his philosophy or his ethics a little bit more general, and to offer a kind of damage control plan, if that makes sense. But once you're already here, your parents fucked up, you're here, what can you do to make that life as good as possible given the circumstances, right?
Yeah. One of the things that I kind of feel, though, from the antinatalist argument with Benatar and like what you're explaining with Cabrera, is it does seem like they're trying to make the idea a little bit more pleasing to the palate by saying things like, well, we don't, we're not pro-mortalist, for example.
Yeah.
But before we talk about that, can you just explain, what does pro-mortalist mean?
So pro-mortalism is a term that's probably even more obscure than antinatalism. There's one guy who coined it. He was a South Korean philosopher by the name of Jae-woon Hwang, I believe. He used to be very active in the antinatalist community, and he basically had the position that if a life is not worth starting, then it's also not worth continuing. So he developed a pro-mortalist position, one that is in favor of suicide, out of his antinatalist position. And he actually debated Benatar once about this, I think, and Benatar obviously disagrees. He just thinks it's a very different issue, right?
Yeah, in a way though, but don't you think that, he's the guy with the big cojones? He's the guy who's taken it to the limits. I mean, if life
really
is suffering, if life is all just completely corrupt and it's like you can't improve yourself and it's all going to end eventually, doesn't it make logical sense that you should just end your life? And he's the one who, again, he took the theory to its natural limitations. And what were you going to say? Did he commit suicide?
He did actually, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay.
And it didn't go so well. I shouldn't be laughing about this.
It didn't go so well? What do you mean
by
that?
He attempted suicide and then was in a state of coma for several months in the hospital until he eventually passed away. It was not very pretty and
that's very
messy. Yeah, it wasn't that nice. And the issue with pro-mortalism as an extension of antinatalism is that it conflates two fundamentally different state of affairs, right? This is Benatar's objection to this, that it's not the same thing when you're considering a situation in which the question is, okay, do I create a new being or do I not? That's different from having a life that is already there, and you have an experiencer who has certain interests, and you ask the question of whether or not that life that is already in the process of being should be continued or not. Those are two different kinds of questions, basically.
Yeah, it seems though like
pro-mortalism is. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It seems though like if, for example, Benatar says that we shouldn't trust our own intuitions and our own personal evaluations of our lives, it seems that the value that he is putting on a life that has already been born doesn't make much logical sense or rational sense to me. How can he even say that he can trust his own evaluation that a life that's already born is worth preserving? Well, does it not kind of make no sense?
I'm not sure what you mean by that, because his point about the optimism bias, that is about, it's about a subconscious bias people have, but that's very different from making a rational logical argument in favor of something. That's certainly something he supports. Otherwise he wouldn't be making these arguments, right?
Okay.
I don't think he's saying that people always have by necessity the wrong idea about the quality of life they can expect. He's just saying that people have this tendency towards that, and that you should be aware of it and work against it by rational and logical consideration. Yeah.
You want to jump in, Jacob?
Yeah, I was curious about. I was mostly curious about this interesting statement from Cabrera, where we could go back to this hopefully, where he says that procreation is a lot more like killing than it is necessarily giving birth. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that's in a roundabout way. That's what he says. He says that ontologically, the change that happens when you create someone is very similar structurally to when you kill someone, right? You're affecting their state of being. In the case of birth, you start out with non-existence and you end with existence. And in the case of killing, it's the reverse. Yeah, you start out with being and you end with non-being. And that's the kind of structural similarity he sees in that. And he also makes a point that the procreative act already has that terminal aspect baked into it, because we know that human beings are mortal creatures, right? And he calls that the structural death, I believe. So he makes a distinction between structural death, which is just a fancy way of saying mortality, and a punctual death, which would be the actual event of somebody's death.
Interesting. Jacob, do you want to continue on with that, or?
I don't want to be too critical of it, but it seems it's a little bit of a sophist argument to me, in the sense that I kind of feel like, yes, life does inevitably end in death, and you can see it is on some level just an ontological reversal, and that when you do bring a life into the world, it invariably does die. But ultimately, the start and stop point are so far in between each other, and most people accept that death will eventually happen. So I don't really. It's still not that persuasive to me. I kind of see how it's going. It just seems a little bit of a sophist argument to me. Go on.
I'm a little bit skeptical of this idea that people necessarily will be accepting of the fact that they die. I believe that people usually try to convince themselves of this, but once you actually get into the situation where this possibility becomes, more real to you,
right?
You get older, or maybe you get very sick, or have an accident, or whatever. Then all of a sudden, all of these survival instincts are kicking in, and you'd probably try to do anything you can just to stay alive. And that's a really heavy burden to impose on somebody, I think.
Sure, I see that. I do actually recollect when my uncle was dying of cancer, there was a moment where he was like, yeah, the odds are really bad, but I've lived I've been very active and very healthy. I think I have a shot at beating this. And it actually...
that would be Banneker's optimism bias at work,
sure.
Basically.
Right, and it actually made the whole affair probably more difficult for everybody, because he kind of did have good arguments. He was a very fit guy, but people who are looking at it objectively were, it was not going to end well, and that this process does make it more painful. I understand that. Yeah, so I see that there is an optimism bias. Also, I don't want to impose too much time here. I did also think about it as you could also make the argument that, death, this is too much about the metaphysics of it, and it doesn't interface very well with the pro-natalist arguments, I guess, but the general view of most Christians, and I would assume Muslims, is that, when we physically die, our soul is immortal, whether we want it to be or not. And so maybe the case is that, I guess, an atheist antinatalist would maybe even consider that people are just rationalizing their mortality, and they only accept death because they've rationalized some kind of immortality is waiting for them. Would that be an antinatalist argument?
Yeah, that's very interesting to bring that up, because there is a relatively new field in psychology that is called terror management theory. Have you ever heard about that?
I have not.
Me neither.
Terror management theory, let me just pull up the article. I believe it's mostly based on the work of Ernest Becker, who was an anthropologist and also interested in psychology, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for his work, The Denial of Death, sometime in the 70s, I think. And yeah, terror management theory is basically based in his work, especially the denial of death, in which he argues that a lot of the things that people do culturally, like religion, societal symbols we value, the kind of stories we tell us, that those are all psychological functions or expressions of death denial. things we tell ourselves in order to cope with this pretty shocking realization that, hey, one day my existence will just be gone, right? And
Yeah.
I believe thorough management theory interfaces pretty well with antinatalist ideas, and just about the extreme, the extremity of the situation, I guess, is what I would call it. That it's a that it's a pretty heavy thing to impose on someone. Yeah.
Right. Kind of an interesting thing to throw in here that we don't necessarily have to dwell on, but I think ties in a very interesting way. A lot of Christian theologians bring up this concept they call therapeutic deism, where the more conservative Christian pastors like James White bring up the idea that so many people, they actually take the Bible and they take the God and they read what they want from it, and they read it so that they can abolish hell, they can abolish all of the things that seem negative about it, and they kind of mold Christianity, and I'm sure it happens in other religions too, they mold it into this friendly, fantastical theology which serves their own purposes of abolishing hell and everyone goes to heaven together forever, the end.
I mean, that's kind of what happened in the Christian Reformation, right? So they abolished a bunch of stuff. They thought, oh, this is a little iffy. It's very scary. Let's just get rid of that, and
So I've actually thought that maybe one of the interesting ways that potentially two very different groups, conservative Christians and antinatalists, can actually benefit is by looking at the views of life that glorify human existence and come up with these basically denial of reality explanations that the world is all going to be okay and everything ends happy. There is certainly some amount of room for agreement in that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, historically, antinatalism had a pretty strong standing in Christian communities, especially Gnostics, which were, of course, persecuted against by other Christians as heretics, essentially. Yeah.
And if you go into Manichaeism,
I believe, the Manichaeans and the Cathars and a bunch of other sects, I don't remember, but yeah. I mean, Christianity, in my opinion, is a fundamentally pessimistic religious philosophy, because the core of it is basically, humanity was created in a state of paradise and unity with God, and then of course the original sin happened and humanity's fall from grace, and now we are trapped in this imperfect world that is basically the world of Satan, right?
Right. And that, I think it's more of a Catholic idea that nature itself is sort of a domain of Satan. And you have in the Bible as well, you have many parts where Christ goes out into the wilderness. And this is precisely the time that the demonic forces sort of descend upon them, right? Solitude, when you exit the world and enter into the solitude of nature, this is also the place where you face the greatest sort of challenge, which I think is true from a literal physical perspective of you have to sustain yourself out there, but also from the perspective that the whole world itself, whether you're among the people who encourage you to sin or you're in the desert where the demonic is present, the world itself is completely fallen, right?
Yeah, I believe that's a very interesting idea philosophically, even though I'm not really interested in it theologically, if that makes sense. It's an interesting concept to look at, and what I enjoyed about learning a bit about these antinatalist traditions in the Gnostic sects was they have a very different conception of how their cosmology works. So they believe in this kind of evil god. I don't really know what they call it, the demiurge or something. I can't pronounce it. Who is actually the creator, or who's the god mentioned in Genesis?
Right.
The god that created the material and physical world, and that this is a distinct entity from the good God who created life and consciousness itself. What they believed is that in the act of procreation, what you're doing is you're trapping this pure soul, which is just floating around in the ether somewhere. You're trapping it in this material prison. And that's how they justified their antinatalism. Yeah. And I found that's a pretty interesting perspective, because I'm not really familiar with what, the standard doctrine is, I guess, on how souls work.
Well, it makes sense though if you were someone to believe that a soul always exists eternally, and it's, let's say, before you're born, it's there floating around, and then it becomes embodied in a human and has to face suffering, and then after you die, it goes back into the spirit world. I can see how perhaps someone might believe that you are doing that spirit a disfavor by embodying them into a life of suffering. Kind of makes sense to me.
What I'm wondering about is more. I don't know what kind of denomination you guys are from, but what is the standard, I guess, Christian position on souls? When does a soul get created? Does God create the soul in the act of procreation, or is the soul already there? Does it really matter if the soul ever gets actualized into the physical world? Or because my rationale behind, if I imagine that I would be a Christian antinatalist, would be that if I never create the soul, if I never actualize the soul into physical form, there's never really a chance for that soul to sin. So you'd remove the risk of sending that soul to hell, basically, by abstaining from procreation.
So Brandon is actually a Protestant. I'm Eastern Orthodox. I can answer the question about when a soul is made, but first let me draw on the Catholic perspective, because the Catholic perspective is more exact. The belief is actually that upon impregnation, the first 48 hours of conception, the soul is being created by God during the first 48 hours. And I don't know the exact theological basis that the Catholics use for this, but you will actually be really surprised if you look at it, because they might literally be pointing to Bible verses and not just some modern understanding of science, which has a biblical rationale tacked onto it. And so they believe the soul is made within the first 2 days of conception, and then from that point on, it absolutely is a life. Orthodoxy,
right?
Yes, and Orthodoxy is not as specific, but the belief that is universally accepted. We're a pro-life church. We believe that the soul essentially comes into being during conception. So,
yeah, that's
I think
what I would
about the same.
Yeah, that's what I've always personally believed, and I've gotten from church. I don't think there are too many Protestants that would believe that there is, like the example we gave, souls, floating around, waiting to be embodied, when two people have sex.
I believe that's probably something that's maybe a remnant of old pagan beliefs, maybe.
It's
just believe in this eternal immaterial existence.
Right. I believe a lot of the Gnostic beliefs, well, especially Manichaeanism, it does have roots in the Near East religions that were common at that time in Greek philosophy, right?
Yeah, I believe they actually have some Buddhist influence in there, and Persian religions.
Oh yeah.
So they are definitely not just pure Christian traditions. There's some other influences. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
But yeah, to bring us back kind of to the topic of antinatalism. So, what would be the Christian rationale, I guess, behind exposing a soul to this risk of going to hell, as opposed to abstaining from doing so?
It's a pretty good question. I guess the way I would see it as that when you procreate and you bring life into the world, that's a gift. We've always been taught that it's a gift. It's a gift from God, and it's I guess it's more of a moral duty to bring life into the world, and I guess to have a new soul embodied, and the fact that that life is going to suffer doesn't really, because life, as Christians see it on earth, is only, a very short time of your existence. You, of course, would believe that, 99.9% of your time you're going to spend, in the afterlife. So,
Of course, yeah.
so
The afterlife is eternal, right?
yeah. So
Right.
I guess the way I would see it is that God tells us that, bringing life into the world, bringing a new soul into the world is a gift, and that, even though you're going to suffer on earth, it's a short period of time. And, I guess the sticking point is there, I guess you technically don't know if you're going to go to heaven or hell. And I think that's where you might make your argument. But, if you go to heaven, right? Yeah. If you go to heaven, then, of course, it was a great thing, wasn't it? That you bring
Sure.
a new soul into existence.
But
That's
my
just
issue
what I
with
would
it.
say off the cuff.
Go ahead.
I would say that my understanding of it is that life on Earth is not necessarily meant to be viewed merely as suffering or as joy, and that the two are actually quite intermingled. And that's why within Christianity there really is an ascetic tradition. If you look at what Christ is saying in some of these passages, he's suggesting to people that if they can, they should actually not get married, and they should live a life celibately, not because he believes that the sexual desires of man are an easy thing to just put down and throw away, but because those who can throw away their sexual desires and their other desires, lust, greed, etc., they are able to achieve and unlock a higher level of enlightenment and of joy. So it's kind of a situation where we would actually say that many of the aspects of the world that appear to be suffering actually can bring a greater amount of joy. And a lot of the apparent joys are actually traps that lead us into a further amount of suffering. So it's kind of an ethical philosophy that, it's got a lot of parallels with Buddhism in this way. And I would go further to say that if you look at the writings of many of the early church fathers, specifically St. Peter of Damascus is really great at this. He talks about how every instance of suffering is actually a way for yourself or for somebody else or others to improve themselves morally. So for instance, even if I have achieved a great level of spirituality and I'm the one who is just dying of a terrible illness and others must watch me, even though I'm not really receiving any benefit from the illness, by still suffering in a way that can give meaning and inspiration to others, that those people can morally improve themselves. Or that a person who suffers from an STD, their suffering from an STD can also, even if they don't personally improve themselves and give up their bad ways, it also serves as an illustration to others about, everything is a lesson for moral improvement. And so that even those who come into the world that potentially do lead these bad lives, we don't know what happens at the very end of their life, maybe they repent, but even the lives that look like they are doomed and lost and going to go to hell can actually have a dramatically positive impact on others, if not themselves. So that's how I would kind of talk about being born and exposed to suffering.
Yeah, I actually agree with a lot of the things you just said. I do think that pleasure and suffering are often they're very intermingled, as you put it, I think. And you see that in words like passion, for example, which comes from a Greek word for pain, but usually we use it in contemporary English to talk about stuff that's very enjoyable, right?
Right.
So suffering and pleasure, they exist on a spectrum almost.
Yeah.
Right?
We know there's like instrumental suffering, for example, going to the gym, working hard to improve your health.
Yeah, the issue I have with this is exactly this instrumentalization, which what I got from what you just explained is that you almost treat people as means to an end, right? So okay, there might be people who live terribly bad lives, full of very extreme suffering, but they might serve as an example for other people and so on. And even though they might go to hell in the end, it was worth it, quote unquote, because they might have improved other people's lives. And I don't really like that, because it's objectifying people almost. It treats them as means instead of ends, right? That's a confident position.
Sure. And well, to respond to that, I would simply say that multiple things are happening at a time. So while another person may be benefiting from seeing someone who has chosen the wrong path and going down it, and that person, ends up going to hell, I would emphasize that while that is all unfolding, that person always has the chance to choose the right path and to avoid going to hell. It's a very important part of doctrine to understand that it is our choice if we go to hell, because ultimately we are choosing a rejection of God in the end. And those who actually do not properly know or understand God, for instance, they would not be seen as being capable of sending themselves to hell, right? So that's where you get the passages like in Luke 12, where they talk about, the servant who did not know his master's will be punished with few stripes. So ultimately, yeah, I think that to ever go to hell involves a conscious choice to reject God and to basically send oneself to hell.
Right. But I guess what I don't understand is why you would still hold on to this idea that you have to bring people into existence in the first place, because I mean, if there is a chance, no matter how big that chance might be, for that person to end up rejecting God and going to hell, isn't that like a very big risk to take? Because I mean, eternal damnation, that's arguably the worst thing that could happen to anyone, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, certainly true.
Well, I would say that so we have free will, but it's commonly thought then that in the Catholic or Orthodox Church that does have this element of free will within it, a little bit more debatable within Orthodoxy, that there isn't really this strong concept of predestination, but generally the concept is that free will works within the concept of predestination. So ultimately God knows who is going to be born, and how that would tie back to antinatalism is kind of this, I guess I would say that plenty of people, it is better for them to choose not to procreate and embrace a monastic or celibate life, but that ultimately to ever bring a life into it is always good. And it's not a sin to have sex, to procreate. So, and even if it is a sin, even if we're talking about someone who has sex before marriage and creates a child, the child itself is always within God's framework of existence. So it doesn't really, interface and match up well with an antinatalist perspective on that, if that makes sense.
I mean, sometimes Christian antinatalists, they use, specific Bible verses to kind of justify their Christian antinatalism, and then other Christians will come in and they cite different Bible verses and say, hey, you're wrong about this, and take a natalist position on this. And I guess it's up for choosing, right? As
right.
You said, everybody has to make that decision themselves.
I'll let Brandon talk after this. Just to throw a small bone to the Christian antinatalists, I have heard very traditional, very wise Christian pastors, well, actually a Catholic priest, talk about the idea that many people end up having unhappy marriages and unhappy families because it was actually never really the path that they should have walked. They were being called to monasticism, either being a monk or a nun, but they just simply refused that out of their personal vanity, and that by choosing to walk this path of natalism, they do end up bringing more suffering into the world. And I've always found that, a very interesting point to think about. I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot, Brandon. You please talk.
Okay, I think before we bring it to a close, I'd just like to, I want to ask you some common, or just present you with some of the common rebuttals to antinatalism, Jonathan. I guess maybe in a
Sure.
kind of a rapid fire. We don't need to spend too much time in each one, and then just tell me, kind of what you think about it. So, for example, um, and I know some of these are more. I know you said you kind of like Cabrera's ideas a bit more than Benatar's, and some of these maybe are skewed more towards Benatar, but just bear with me here. So, what would you say to the question of would it not be worth killing all humans now to save the countless billions of progeny from even greater amounts of suffering? So, for let's just say, for example, the Earth will go on for millions of more years, and humans will exist for millions of more years, and of course there will be billions and billions more humans that will face suffering. Is it not better to just, let's say we had a magic red button to kill all humans on Earth? Would it not just be worth it to do it?
Right. This red button thought experiment, or I believe originally it was called the Benevolent World Exploder or something like that. That's a thought experiment that gets discussed a fair bit in antinatalist circles. It originally was a thought experiment that was designed to show the absurdity of taking a negative utilitarian position to its logical conclusion, right? That if you're a negative utilitarian, that means you value the minimization of suffering. Logically, this entails that if you had this magical red button that would just from one moment to the next, if you push it, make all life disappear, that you should push it, right? And if you are a negative utilitarian, I believe you should accept this. There's really no way around it. If you're really just concerned with outcomes and you determine the good or badness of those outcomes by measuring how much suffering and pleasure there is, you absolutely should push that button if you have the opportunity to.
Okay.
And some people in the community, they made this what originally was supposed to be an argument against negative utilitarianism, and they kind of incorporated into their view.
Yeah. So
and this is the source of a small community split, I guess you could say. There are those who are more inclined to agree with utilitarianism as their meta-ethical framework, and then there are those who are more have a more deontological, virtue-based ethics as their more framework. And those people usually disagree with the assertion that if you had the opportunity, you should push the button. And I guess that's more the camp I'm in. Yeah, I don't.
So you would not push the button?
Probably not. No.
Probably not. So there is
there's a chance. A chance.
Okay.
I might. But,
okay.
From going from my principles, I think I would not push that button. Okay. Because I believe that killing is just as much an imposition as creating a new life is.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. So, one of the things that people notice, in life is that it's kind of rare to actually meet somebody who, never wishes they were born. Of course, these people do exist, but if you go out to the street and ask someone, are you happy you were born? The majority of people, I'd say the vast majority of people, are going to say yes. So would you say that like antinatalism therefore doesn't it doesn't pass the smell test with people? Like antinatalism kind of relies on a purely materialistic perspective, I would say. And the fact that humans themselves don't really wish that they were never born, is there something more to be said there, that perhaps this theory and I guess materialism in itself is missing something?
Well, first, I disagree with this assertion that antinatalism necessarily has to be a materialistic worldview, because a lot of antinatalists historically were not materialists, like Arthur Schopenhauer, for example, whom you mentioned in the introduction. He was an idealist, right? he believed in this idea of this metaphysical will, which controls everything and kind of propels the world forward. So I disagree with that, but that's not really relevant to the rest of what you just said, in my opinion. There is an anti-natalist philosopher who's called David Pearce. He is most well known for his arguments for transhumanism. He has this little project he calls Humanity Plus, and the abolitionist project, I believe he calls it, which is about reducing suffering by means of bioengineering, that kind of stuff. The typical transhumanist ideas. But he's also an anti-natalist. And he agrees with antinatalism in principle, but he rejects it on a practical basis, right? And this goes into what you've just said. He argues that there's a selection pressure, a biological selection pressure against antinatalism. Because obviously people who accept the antinatalist conclusion, they don't have kids, and so they're less likely to pass on this idea to their offspring, because they don't have offspring unless they're maybe adopting or having foster children or whatever.
Okay.
So I think that would explain why usually when you meet someone on the street and ask them, hey, what's your view of procreation, they're probably not antinatalists.
Okay, I got two more of them for you. So what would you say about the idea that if let's say everybody on Earth decided to no longer procreate, would you, like, this is a thought experiment, don't you think that would perhaps create, excessive harm on humanity? So for example, if everybody knows that, okay, we're the last generation, we've kind of, all agreed that we're not going to procreate, the harm that and the suffering that would cause for people to know that there's never going to be another human on Earth again, does this additional harm on the living, wouldn't that just kind of permit, okay, let's just have another generation? Like, is it not worth it to have this additional harm on the actual lives that have been born?
Well, for one thing, I'm not sure I would say that the knowledge that humanity goes extinct constitutes a harm, right? Because realistically, we know that at some point, eventually, humanity will go extinct, right? That's almost a given.
True,
and
but
we usually don't think about that as a bad thing. It's just something that happens, right?
But don't you think the fact that if you knew it was happening during you were the last people, don't you think that could create undue suffering? Whereas, I don't think about, the universe, or the universe dying from, what was it called? The expansion, the cold death or heat death, I don't think about that because I know that that's not going to happen in my lifetime. But if it were perhaps going to happen in my lifetime, I think I would think about that a lot, and it might create a lot of suffering.
Sure, but in this hypothetical or thought experiment where humanity chooses to but voluntarily go extinct, I think it's paradoxical to assume that people would view this as a bad thing if they voluntarily choose to do so, right? So if you just imagine that for whatever reason, I know it's very unlikely and probably is never going to happen, but just assuming that a critical mass or the majority of people adopt the antinatalist position and say, all right, so we're going to phase out humanity in maybe like 1 or 2, maybe 3 generations. I don't think that those people who would make that decision with the explicit goal to let humanity go extinct would view that as a bad thing. But I agree that there are, of course, a lot of complications about that because, we have a certain infrastructure in place that assures that people have access to basic necessities and things like that. And we have a whole industry of production going on that ensures that vital goods are provided to people and so on. And if you were to hypothetically propose such a voluntary extinction, you'd kind of have to sort those issues out, right? That production doesn't completely just break down and people go feral, basically.
Okay.
Right. And I see that as a potential source of suffering, right? If just the material needs of the people can't be provided for anymore because the population that's left is too old and isn't able to produce what's necessary.
Okay. All right, so this
I
is the
think
last.
that's a valid concern.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. So this is the last one I have for you. I guess it kind of is more geared towards Benatar, but I think it's possible that it could kind of rebut Benatar, or sorry, Cabrera as well. So like through the development of technology, might it be possible in the future to kind of tip the balance of, suffering and pleasure way more towards pleasure? So for example, medical technology, let's say we live longer, there's less disease. Through the creation of AI, we don't have to, work and toil in the field and at work anymore. We can kind of just focus on, what we like to do and pleasure, essentially.
Right.
Do you think it's possible that in the future that, I guess, this pleasure suffering balance, really does tip, and then antinatalism just becomes sort of an extinct philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, if this pleasure suffering balance is what you use as justification for your antinatalism, I think this is a very valid point. And the guy I just mentioned, David Pierce, that's exactly his argument. Basically, he says that I in principle agree with antinatalism. I believe the way he describes biological life is as Darwinian malware. like a malfunctioning program, basically. And
It's very poetic.
he's a very funny guy. Yeah. He's very nice. And his argument is, well, on the basis of this selection pressure bias, that there's against antinatalism a transhumanist solution to the problem of suffering is more likely and should be worked towards instead of working towards a voluntary extinction.
So
if you base your antinatalism in this perceived imbalance between suffering and pleasure, I believe that's a very valid point as well.
Yeah, and just to take it one step further, it seems to me that if we do believe that, technology will eventually reach a point that it makes our lives very pleasurable and much less painful, then you could almost see the antinatalism movement as being counterproductive to that fact. So by not having children who potentially could further the future technology of the world that will eventually reduce the suffering of all humans, that you're actually creating more suffering because you're slowing down the process of the advancement of technology, which creates more suffering.
Right. That's what I usually call the but what if my kid is Einstein objection, right? That people like to think that, oh yeah, my children will be super instrumental in improving the world or whatever, when in reality they're probably not going to be that special, right? They're just going to be another guy or another woman among many. And I believe if you take this issue seriously, I don't think this argument has much weight, because for one thing, there's already like how many humans? 8 billion, I believe, right now in the world, and the population is still rising, even though birth rates in certain countries have fallen off, even below replacement level. But I don't think that even though as very, very few people choose not to procreate for ethical reasons, that the human race will go extinct anytime soon, at least not voluntarily. Who knows?
Okay.
Maybe climate change will change something about that. But I think it's a disingenuous objection, because just because certain individuals make the choice not to procreate, that doesn't mean that the human race will immediately go extinct, right?
Yes,
that's kind of the position
true.
that I take. I believe it's a personal choice. It's a personal ethical stance about my life and the choices that I want to do. And I don't think I should be obliged to have children.
Okay.
Right. Just curious. I'm surprised we didn't touch on this earlier. Would you say that eventually the world peacefully going extinct due to lack of birth Is that a goal, or is that something you don't really think about? This is more of a personal stance.
I believe it's more like an idealized scenario. I wouldn't say it's a set goal of my philosophy because, as I just explained, for me it's really just about personal decision, what choices I can make and whether or not these choices are right or wrong. Some antinatalists, they do view it in this broader scale aspect that we should work towards a voluntary extinction, and there's been what's this called? The voluntary human extinction movement. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's been around for a while, and it's an American guy whose name is just slipping me. Last night, I believe is his name. Yeah. He founded this voluntary human extinction movement, and this is basically an antinatalist movement whose main justification for why their set goal really is an voluntary extinction is because of environmental reasons, right? So his argument is that our presence on this planet is hugely disruptive to the ecosystem. It causes all sorts of suffering, both in our own species as well as all the other species that are living around us, and that we should really strive towards a voluntary extinction. So that's certainly a position some antinatalists do have, but it's not the stated goal of all antinatalists.
Sure.
Yeah. So there's some there's antinatalism activism, and then there's people just have a personal belief. You're more just on the personal belief side.
Yeah, for me it's really just it's about justifying my own actions more than anything else. Right.
Okay. So Verv, is there anything else you'd like to say, or would you like to wrap us up here?
Sure. I would just like to say I suspected that it would be a really big conversation that would be kind of like two ships passing in the night, because it's hard to interface with some of these views that are just so fundamentally different. But it was definitely very pleasurable, and I really appreciated it. And I hope that in the future we could touch on this issue again with you, Jonathan.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It was really pleasurable to talking to you guys, and I hope I wasn't too confused because I'm not as structured as a guy like Beneta would be, obviously, since I'm not doing this professionally. But yeah, I had a really good time, and I hope that some of your listeners can maybe take something useful away from this conversation.
Yeah, I also had a great time, and thank you again for joining us. Would you like to make any plugs?
Yeah. If you're interested in the issues of procreative ethics, or just philosophy in general, or like to just hang out in a place where people discuss these sort of issues, you can go to the subreddit for antinatalism, which is just r/antinatalism. And if you go to the chat section in the sidebar, there's a link to our Discord server, where you can just hang out, or maybe even if you don't agree, you can just come in and talk to people if you're curious and want to know more.
Okay, thank you very much. With that being said, I think we will sign off now. So yeah, Verv, anything else?
Thank you, everyone, for your patience in listening to the podcast, and especially, again, thank you to Jonathan. See you next time.